Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Across the Sky, our Lee Enterprises weather podcast. I'm Matt Holiner, covering weather for all of Lee's Midwest websites, apps, and social media accounts, and I'm joined by my fellow meteorologist, Joe Martucci with the Press of Atlantic City in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and Sean Sublette with the Richmond Times-Dispatch in Richmond, Virginia. And for this episode, yes, it's just April. Hurricane season does not begin until June 1st, but we're starting to get some indications, some early signs of what we might expect this hurricane season. Of course, we got to get through severe weather season first, but we know there's lots of interest once we get to this time of year and we start to get warmer temperatures. Even in the Midwest where I am, my goodness, 80-degree weather. But then you start thinking, wait a minute, with warmer weather also comes warmer sea surface temperatures. And you start looking to the Atlantic. When we get an early season surprise this year, and then what about the peak of Atlantic hurricane season? So we're going to start to share some of our thoughts, what's going to help this season, what's going to hinder it, and what are we ultimately going to get? So guys, what are some of your initial thoughts as we look ahead to hurricane season? Of course, with you guys being closer to the coast, the impact's a little bit higher as well.
Yeah, I mean, we are the Press of Atlantic City. Atlantic City sits smack dab on the Jersey Shore here. Many of us, very, very cognizant of Superstorm Sandy, which I just can't even believe, but it was 11 years ago here. Looking at the Colorado State University forecast, they're kind of like the gold standard along with the National Hurricane Center for these forecasts. Fairly average for this compared to climatology. So, 13 named storms, average is 14.4. 6 hurricanes, the average is 7.2. Major hurricanes, that's category 3, 4, or 5 hurricanes is a 2, average is 3. I think we can certainly take, a little bit of a sigh of relief that we're not being forecasted to be above average, especially over the past couple of years. I think El Nino is really the player for this. After 3 winters in a row with a La Nina, and we talked about that in our winter forecast episode back in November, we're transitioning into an El Nino. That's warmer than average waters along the equatorial Pacific. Basically, I tell people go off the coast of Peru and your temperatures are above average. That should stifle some tropical development. At the same time, waters generally in the North Atlantic are above average. That's been the trend for the past couple of decades. We don't see that going away anytime soon. So that can really help to fuel some storms. To be honest, Matt, for us at the Jersey Shore, I think, Sean would say something similar. We never let our guard down. That being said, it could definitely be in a more impactful area like the Gulf Coast or Florida.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, Joe, anywhere in the middle Atlantic and Southeast coast always needs to be mindful during hurricane season. And, these exercises and the folks at Colorado State have been doing this for 40 years now. These exercises in seasonal hurricane forecasting are very important so that we get a better understanding of how the ocean and the atmosphere kind of react in this way and what kind of seasons do they produce. I don't know if you guys get this, but I still get a lot of like, well, why bother doing this? If it only takes one, why do you care? Well, one thing, we need to understand the ocean and atmosphere better. 2, insurance companies are really interested in this kind of stuff. Even if just an individual homeowner or an individual business owner may not care that much, or this might not change their preparation at the beginning of the season, it's still important in the longer term understanding and ultimately for business impacts as well, right? We like to tell people no matter what the outlook is, if one hits your backyard or you get flooded out or whatever, then it's been a bad season for you. I think the classic example of this is Hurricane Andrew in 1992, when that was during a very otherwise relatively quiet season. But obviously, the impacts of Andrew in South Florida still being felt today, which is, 30 years later. So I think the key here is that this is important. It shouldn't change preparation, I think, for anybody, but it is nice to see, for me, I'm really curious because as you said, Joe, we're coming off of 3 consecutive La Ninas. Now all the numerical guidance is just screaming like we're going to get an El Nino. And that tends to inhibit hurricane development. Doesn't prevent it, but of course it backs it off a fair bit. But at the same time, we've got very high temperatures with respect to normal of the water in the Atlantic. So there's also this kind of academic idea in my head. So which one of these things is going to win out, you know?
And I think to make sure that we're clear for people who aren't familiar, when we're talking about El Nino, we're talking about above normal sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, but we're also seeing above normal sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic. But the thing is, the Pacific being a larger body of water, when you get those above normal sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, right now we're in a neutral phase, to be clear. We've come out of La Nina and we're in a neutral phase, but already we're seeing a warming trend. Like the Pacific's getting ready to transition to El Nino. I think that's the question, is how quickly does that occur? Because when you get above normal sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, what happens is there's increased wind shear across the Atlantic. And when there's more wind shear across the Atlantic, higher level winds, that tears up these storms and makes it harder for them to form. So typically when you have El Nino, you see reduced tropical activity in the Atlantic, and it's the opposite. La Nina in the Pacific causes enhanced tropical activity in the Atlantic because of the reduced wind shear across the Atlantic. So it's an opposite effect. La Nina enhances Atlantic hurricane season. El Nino causes it to typically be lower. But the catch this year is we're seeing above normal sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic. So you're absolutely right, Sean. Which one of these is going to win out? And I think what it's ultimately going to come down to is how quickly does El Nino form. If it holds off a little bit and doesn't get going, we don't really see a true El Nino set up and that increased wind shear until September or October. Watch out for July and August, I say, because the water is definitely going to be warm enough. And if there's not much wind shear, then we could get some activity. It was remarkable how quiet August was last year. I would be surprised if we had the same result again this year. So, for people who are going to continue to monitor this in the months and weeks ahead, it's how quickly do we get El Nino to actually set up in the Pacific? The sooner the better, because that'll increase the wind shear and make it less likely that hurricanes will form. But if it takes longer, then I think we have to watch out.
You reminded me, Matt, about how quiet we were for a while here with our tropical systems. I believe we went, and here we go. We're looking at it now. From July 2nd to September 1st, we had not one storm. And typically August is when you really ramp it up. We had nothing. We ended at Colin on the 2nd. Then we had Danielle in September. I believe maybe you guys know. Was it the only time in tropical history we went without a named storm in August? Anybody remember that? I feel like that was a nugget.
That seems to stick into my head, at least in the modern era, at least in the satellite era. I think that's the case. Again, like you said, I'd have to go back and look it up. My sense, and see if y'all remember this the way I do, was that there was a little more Saharan dust in August.
There was.
Or we were in a phase of the Madden-Julian oscillation, which also did not favor tropical development. And that's just off the top of my head. I can't remember that for certain, but I think those two things kind of put a little squashing on the activity in August of last year in a time that would otherwise be fairly active.
No, you're 100% right on the dust, Sean. And I remember that not only for the reasons you said, but Florida, there was haze in the sky from Florida from some of that dust as well. And I'm actually looking at it's called the United States Drought Monitor. And, you look at Florida, I do believe some of the reason why Florida is in drought right now is because of that dust last summer, which really helps to dry things out. And they didn't get a lot of rain starting back to last year. And I'm looking at it now, a year ago, 21% at this time, Florida was in drought. Now it's 66%. And there was that increase throughout the summer and fall of last year, which got them to that point. So, yeah, I mean, and again, that was good that we were quiet, relatively quiet through August, but then we went to September. We kind of made up for that really quickly because we had Danielle, Earl, Fiona, Gaston, Ian, Hermine. We even had a tropical depression in there. And Ian, of course, that's pretty close to the Mount Rushmore of most significant hurricane impacts you'll see.
And what is it with the ice storms, by the way? We've noticed this, right? For some reason, the ice storms tend to have this, whether it's just a statistical freak or whatever, but the ice storms, I think, have been more retired than any other storm, when we go through it alphabetically, we have these lists of storms, it's repeated every 6 years, or these 6 lists, because people are like, where do they name these things anyway? Well, there are 6 main lists for the Atlantic hurricanes. So they're repeated every 6 years. And every once in a while, when a storm is especially bad, causes a big loss of property or there are fatalities, the name is retired because it's such an impactful event. The name doesn't want to be repeated. And that's done by the World Meteorological Organization. And Ian was retired from last year. And do y'all remember what was the other one that was retired last year?
Yeah, that was Fiona, Sean.
Fiona, yes.
Yeah, which was just like 2 weeks before Ian.
Did a lot of damage in the Canadian Maritimes, of all places.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it was the most costly storm to hit Canada, if I recall right. And that's a big reason why it was being retired. It was also damaging in the Caribbean, not really an impact to the US, but they don't get, typically the cold water kicks in and these things dissipate before they actually make landfall in Canada. But that one did not happen. It was moving fast and came in, I think, only as a category 1, but a category 1 in Canada is a big deal. And so I'm pretty sure I've read that it was the most costly storm.
Yeah. And to your point, we always have to be careful about saying only quote unquote category 1, because there's still so much water with these things as well. This goes back, we could speak for like 3 or 4 hours about the Saffir-Simpson scale, right? About impacts, and don't get so locked in with the category when it comes to impacts, because they can rain like crazy and be quote unquote only a Cat 1, and they can do massive amount of flooding even though it's only a Cat 1. I mean, Sandy was a Cat 1 transitioning to an extratropical cyclone as it came on shore at the Jersey Shore, and that all this. I mean, Joe, you know about this way more than I do, buddy. But yeah, these things, no matter what their category, they do damage.
Sandy, of course, was it wasn't technically a Cat 1 at landfall. It was a post-tropical cyclone. Just to speak on behalf of my New Jersey brethren, our last landfalling hurricane was back in the 1910s. We have not had a landfalling hurricane since then. Going back to that eye, though, Sean, we've had 13 eye storms retired. That is the most. And we had 3 this decade: Ian, Ida, which was the year before, and then Iota.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if we want to. Yeah,
I don't think we should count that, though.
I'm sorry,
because it wasn't the 9th one, because that whole weird Greek alphabet thing.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, do we want to go down that rabbit hole?
Well, the other thing is that we don't do the Greek alphabet anymore. If we run out of names,
No.
there's a secondary list. So if we run out of the primary list, we don't do this alpha, beta, gamma stuff anymore.
Yeah. Which I think is probably much better. If I think people got a little too attached to the Greek letter, like, oh, we're going Greek, and then, all the fraternity memes come out on Twitter with the hurricanes and all that good stuff. And then on a serious point, what do you do when you have a Greek alphabet storm that was tremendously impactful and, it gets brought up for a vote to be retired because there's no other Greek letter.
I think that was part of the impetus for doing it, if I remember.
It was, yeah. Good. What did you say? What was that word, Sean?
Impetus.
That's a good vocab word for our Across the Sky podcast listeners. I think with that was such a great word, Sean. I think we'll take a break.
And that also starts with I.
Yes, it does. It also starts with I. We'll retire for a little bit after that I, and we'll come back in just a minute. Everybody here, thank you for listening, and we'll be back with you in just a second on the Across the Sky podcast.
And welcome back, everyone, to the Across the Sky podcast. We come out with new episodes every Monday, and we do thank you for listening. We have seen our audience steadily grow. We just had a meeting about how things are going with the big bosses, and they were happy with the podcast. So we do appreciate it. If people weren't listening, we would have been canceled. But we have not been canceled. We are continuing. And if you enjoy the podcast, also give us wherever you listen to your podcast, give us a review, give us a rating. That helps as well. So do thank you for tuning in. And this week's episode, all about hurricanes. And the main reason we decided to do a hurricane-themed episode, even though it's April and kind of getting into the peak of severe weather season, is because Colorado State usually comes out with the first forecast for the Atlantic hurricane season every year. And they just came out with the one for 2023. And we mentioned it at the top of the episode. But to recap, their forecast for this Atlantic hurricane season, beginning June 1st, 2023, and going through November 30th, they're calling for 13 named storms. And of those 13 named storms, that includes tropical storms and hurricanes, of those 13 named storms, 6 becoming hurricanes and 2 becoming major hurricanes. And compare that to a normal year, we typically see 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. So they're basically going one number below the average. And in their reasoning for it, they're conflicting issues with the forecast. So we do expect El Nino to form and wind shear, more wind shear than usual across the Atlantic. So that should hold down activity. But the problem is we're seeing above average sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic. So which one wins out? And because we're thinking maybe El Nino could end up setting up actually this summer, even before the fall, where they're leaning with El Nino winning out just slightly. So basically a near normal season. But I guess that is better compared to what we dealt with in 2020 and 2021. Now, 2022 was actually near normal, but it was looking like it was going to be above normal season. I think everybody definitely had some PTSD after 2020 and 21, 2 blockbuster years. So it kind of caught a break a little bit, but I tell you what, people in Florida don't think they caught a break last year with Ian coming through. So again, that was another example of how, it was, especially we went through that quiet August and nothing was going on. And then boy, did things change. So that's why you can't let your guard down, even though it's technically being forecast right now, and there are other forecasts to come, and we'll see how this all plays out. Still, when you're talking about a near average hurricane season, that does not mean you need to go through the motions of not preparing for a hurricane, because we could absolutely have multiple landfalls in the U.S. And that's the thing we can't forecast, is where these things are going to occur. Are they just going to be out in the middle of the ocean, or are they going to make landfall? And we can't say that this far out. So guys, what else are you thinking about this upcoming hurricane season?
I'm thinking about some of the changes that the Hurricane Center has put out. Every year they put out this this memo that says what's new and what's updated for the season. And in terms of the forecast cone, I think that's always the sexy one. That's the one that we think about the most here. Not much of a change with that forecast cone. There's been a little bit of an adjustment towards a narrower cone, 60 and 72 hours out, but we're really talking like a matter of like miles. And then at 96 and 120 actually expands like 3 miles at 96 hours, 5 miles at 120 hours. And that cone, and I love to talk about this because I feel like it's time that we need to change the definition of the cone. Right now, it's where the center of the storm is with 66% confidence. And I just think we're so good at forecasting the track and even the intensity of hurricanes. We should make that 75% or something higher. I think people believe that forecast cone is 100% certainty, and it's not. So I always like to get on that. I think we do such a good job. I think it's time to become a little more confident and expand it.
I think there's a lot of merit to that argument, Joe. I think, no, after last year and what happened with Ian, there was a lot of people revisiting the cone and what the cone really meant. And we realized, and I think we always realized this to a point, that people misunderstand the cone. They just don't understand it the way we think they understand it. There's certainly a lot of value in there, but I have tried to tell people it's an important thing, but it's not the only thing. I mean, if you think about the last 10 or 15 years since the cone has really been very highly visible in forecasting, public-facing forecasts, I mean, we push the cone out all the time, and we haven't done a good enough job. I mean, not the three of us, but I think the community needs to do a better job at saying impacts are not limited to the cone. Sing along if you know the words. The impacts are not limited to the cone. All right, this is our best guess of where the center is going to be. And yeah, near the center, that's where the wind is going to be the most ferocious. But impacts extend far away from the cone, especially storm surge, especially storm surge. I think this is kind of what we need to drive home even more. We keep working. It's a work in progress, right? But back to your point about the historical probabilities, Joe. I think we have reached a point where we can do something that's a lot more dynamic. This is where we feel with 75% confidence or whatever percent confidence, this is where it's going to be in this time frame. The other thing I'd like to see, and this is tougher, but start when Hurricane Center puts these things out. And of course, we've got a new Hurricane Center director from Virginia, which is cool for around here. Guy from Cave Spring, which is where I used to work many moons ago. Anyway, to put someplace on a map that is clear, like we know it's not going here. You plop a big map of the Gulf Coast and you put, like, I don't know, let's say New Orleans to Brownsville, that's green. We know absolutely it's not going there. We know that. Or incorporate something like that, because one of the things I think a lot of the social science is teaching us is people want to know when they can stop paying attention. They want to know when it's safe. Not just, they want to know when the threat ends. They want to know when they're safe. And I don't know the best way to do that. That's a social science question, but I think there's some value in that if we can do it the right way.
Now, Sean, I think you're absolutely right about letting people know when you don't have to worry anymore, because oftentimes, we start watching these things, when they come off of Africa as a little tropical wave. And basically we have to tell everybody, look, this has the potential to develop, but we really do not know if this one's just going to curve out into the Atlantic, if it's going to make its way into the Caribbean, maybe the Gulf. And so basically we have to tell everybody, like, the whole East Coast, it has to be on standby for this one. But that's very early on. And so people, and of course that gets lots of buzz on social media. And then, especially once you do get a storm, it looks like it's going to go into the Gulf, then we have to say the whole Gulf Coast has to be on alert, because there's still a lot of uncertainty in where this is going to go. And so then everybody in the Gulf Coast gets all worked up and it's on social media and starts to get nervous. But inevitably, that's why you have to keep following the updates. Don't see one forecast, especially when it's 5 days out, and think, oh, that's it. It's going to change. There are going to be adjustments. There's going to be greater confidence in where that storm is going to go, and wherever is the most likely path 5 days out, 4 days out, that is likely going to change, unfortunately. That's why we give you a range of possibilities. But I think you're very right, Sean. At some point, as you get closer and closer to the landfall, the folks that are going to be feeling the impacts, the number does get smaller. And so letting people clearly know, like, this area, like Louisiana on west, does not have to worry about this storm. Like, making that very clear, because sometimes I do think that gets lost, because then people stop hearing about their location, but they're still concerned because they were never given the all clear. And until somebody hears that all clear, then you get an unnecessary number of people that are overly worked up, anxious, making unnecessary preparation. So yeah, I do think that just as important as messaging who needs to prepare and who is going to feel the worst impacts, letting people know who is not going to be impacted. I think you're absolutely right. That needs to happen as well.
Yeah. And there's been a couple of options out there to change, how the cone looks. I've seen some like things where like the cone is like really, dark in where the best forecast is. And then, gets a little lighter as you spread out to show some more ideas of the impacts, because anywhere in the cone is at the same, has the same. You should be concerned anywhere within that cone, even if you're not in the middle. And the Hurricane Center did a good job a couple of years ago. Maybe you guys remember what year it is, but removing that line, that connects those dots. Now there's the dots. Sometimes, like in my forecast, I don't even show the dots. I just show the cone. But that was a good call. It's a lot of social science stuff that we keep getting better at, and really was triggered a lot by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 here. Just looking at some other updates to the Hurricane Center, and I just had it, and then I lost it. Hold on, give me 1 second, everybody. We're gonna do this in real time.
Well, while you're looking for that, Joe, I think what's worthwhile and a big question that a lot of people get, since this is our outlook episode for the upcoming hurricane season, one of the big questions that always comes up is what names are on the list this year? Yeah, because remember, there are 6 lists that rotate. So if your name does come up one year, you're going to have to wait 6 years for it to come up again. But we do have this year's list. So I'm just going to run down from A through W what the names are and see if your name is on the list. Number A, and the problem is if you have a name low in the way down the alphabet, sometimes we never get to that name unless it's a really active hurricane season. So maybe, especially if you have a W there's a W. We don't want to get to the W storm, but we do have it on the list. So let's just run through it real quick. Most likely, we will get an Arlene. That is storm one, number one. And also, by the way, remember these names alternate between female and male. So it's a female name, then a male name, a female name, then a male name. And then next year, it'll start with a male name and go to a female name. So Arlene is number one. And then it's Brett. The sea storm is Cindy. Then we have Don, Emily, Franklin, Gert, Harold. I believe it's Idalia. I've got the pronunciation guide up here too. The ice storm is a little bit tricky one. Idalia, Jose, Katia. I believe it's Katia is how it's pronounced. Lee, Margot. The end storm is Nigel. Then we have Ophelia, Philippe, Rena, Sean. We've got a Sean on this year's list. I hope we don't make it to the S storm, but Sean, it is a possibility. I might use your name this year. Tammy, Vince, and the W storm is Whitney. You know, I actually like this list this year because most of these are pretty easy to pronounce. There's some years where there are some that are real tough, and there's lots of discussion exactly how do you say this. And I'm glad the Hurricane Center comes out with a pronunciation guide, because some years their names are a little bit tougher than usual. This is an international list of names. It's the World Meteorological Organization that puts together these name lists. So that's why it's not just U.S. names. It is names from around the world. So that's why you sometimes hear some unusual, odd names. And especially when it comes to the ice storms, because so many have been retired, you sometimes have to go and find some rather unique names. But that is the list for 2023.
Have either one of you had your names retired? I don't think so. Have they?
I haven't even looked at her. Well, Matthew, yeah.
Yeah, Hurricane Matthew was retired.
Okay, that's right.
So unless currently Matt is not on, they haven't added Matt to the list.
They probably going to let that die with Matthew. Yeah, but I don't know if has there been a Hurricane Joseph? Because I've got the list of all 6 years. I don't see Joseph up here.
There's a Josephine.
Josephine, yeah.
And Jose.
Yes.
Very close.
Which is going to be
Jose is on the list this year.
Is on the list for this year. Sean, I was going to ask you though, and I can ask Matt too. Have you guys covered those storms with your name in your career? Like Sean, have you had?
No, because Sean came up because there was another S storm that was retired, and that name, and I forget what storm, but there was an S storm that was retired. I want to say 6 or 12 years ago, and then SEAN was added to the list. I'd have to go back and look to see what name was retired, but that hasn't been on the list that long.
Would it be kind of odd to cover a storm with your name?
I'm going to go, yeah.
I remember doing it with a Hurricane Matthew. Now, to be clear, I was in Cincinnati, Ohio at the time. I was working at the Fox station there because this storm occurred in late September, early October of 2016. And so I was in Cincinnati at the time. So I was not being directly impacted by it. But when you have a storm that's impacting the U.S., every meteorologist in the country is going to talk about it. So I was certainly talking about it. And I think what helped me is, though my legal name is Matthew, everybody calls me Matt. So it didn't seem that odd to say Hurricane Matthew. It wasn't like I was directly repeating my name and everybody was like, oh, hey, Matt, what's the situation with Matthew? And so it sounded a little bit different. I think that helped make it not seem as odd because of it being Matthew instead of Matt, and everybody calls me Matt. So it wasn't too odd. And especially because I didn't have to talk about it all the times, it wasn't directly impacting me.
And I just looked up Hurricane Stan in 2005 was retired. And then my name went into there, Sean, SEAN. So Stan was right. Sandy was retired.
What year was that again, you said?
Stan was 2005. Sandy, of course, was retired too, but that was 12.
Well, it was 2012, yeah.
Right. So that for 23, that doesn't cycle in. So it had to be Stan in 05.
Gotcha.
I guess before we wrap up this episode, let's just kind of go around the horn and talk about our most memorable hurricane experience. You know, from, again, they start to blend together after a while, you know, and I know some people that were, you know, directly impacted by storms, and I've covered, you know, so many, but most of them indirectly. But I would have to say my most memorable experience is one that actually I was covering blow by blow and actually experienced at the same time, and that was Hurricane Hannah in 2020 that moved over deep South Texas. And again, that was a great example of, it was just a category 1, but my goodness, were there some tremendous impacts. Now, where it actually made landfall, Hurricane Hannah, I was in the Rio Grande Valley at the time, which is deep South Texas. Brownsville, McAllen are probably the most notable cities down there. Now, it made landfall north of there. Technically, the eye came in just north of the 4 counties in the valley. But what this storm did is, after it made landfall, it took a dive to the south and west. So it did move over our viewing area in the Rio Grande Valley. And the winds were incredible, even though we were technically, again, it was already inland, but the winds that this thing was cranking, and we weren't even in the most populated part of the valley, wasn't even in the area with the worst winds, but how much wind damage there was from this was impressive. So I can't, it was hard to imagine, like, if this had been a category 4, category 5, I mean, it was already just tremendously windy. But I think, ultimately, despite the wind damage, the amount of tree damage that was done and roof damage, my apartment had shingles removed. There was actually a leak that developed in my apartment, all these things that end up happening. But ultimately, again, it wasn't the wind that was the worst part. As bad as it was the amount of rain, because what happened is the storm just slowed down and it basically almost stalled out just to the southwest down in Mexico, and just kept rotating though. And these rounds of rain kept coming in. And even in these rain bands, there were some embedded tornadoes. Like, technically the hurricane itself had passed, but these rain bands on the back side of it had some little weak circulations, little weak tornadoes popped up on the back side of it. And just the rounds of rain, the flooding that we saw, until you go through a hurricane and you've actually lived through it, you realize how long they last oftentimes, and just all the different impacts and all the different things. I mean, that's why it's just the most fascinating weather out there, because you can have tornadoes within the hurricane and the flooding and the wind. It was truly an incredible experience, but one was enough. I'm okay not covering living through another hurricane. That was good for me.
Yeah. So for me, it goes back. The first one I was in was this first incarnation of Hurricane Charlie in August of 1986. We were scheduled to go on vacation to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and we knew it was coming. Of course, this is 86. All you had was television and radio. We didn't even have the Weather Channel at my house in Richmond. So I remember this very well, because we decided to go anyway, even though the hurricane was coming in. And as we were going out the back door to get in the car to drive from Richmond to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, my mom's like, "Should we still go?" She looks at me. I'm 16 years old, weather geek. She looks at me, "Should we still go?" I'm like, "Well, it's too late to decide now. Let's go." And we went. We made it. I mean, we rode it out. We got down there before we had the biggest impacts. It actually pushed back offshore. But that was a windy day for sure. We didn't go anywhere that day. And then the rest of the week, the weather was just kind of But that was the first one I was legit in terms of a legit tropical system. And ironically, because I covered a lot during my TV days, I didn't go down to the shore. We always sent somebody else to go cover them at the coastline. I was doing most of the anchoring from the studio. So I haven't been in that many of them. But in terms of other impacts, Isabel is also one of the top ones here recently in Virginia. But, all of our big flooding events here in Virginia are tropical systems. If you go back to Agnes, not Hazel. Hazel was big in the 50s, but Agnes, Camille, leftovers from Juan in 85. It's all about the water here, man.
Yeah. And for me, there's not one weather event I could think of that puts sometimes tears in my eyes than Superstorm Sandy in 2012. We were without power for about a week. We knew some people who had power loss for more than 2 weeks. It was a storm, famous for its left turn right into Brigantine, just north of Atlantic City here. And the destruction you saw on our barrier islands was tremendous. And I think the one part that separates New Jersey from other coastal states is that our whole shore is a barrier island, and it juts out into the water. I shouldn't say the whole shore, but 90% of the shore, and the memories and the economy and all the good times you had were laying there in shambles. And that included where I went to a lot every year growing up, which was Seaside, which in many ways was ground zero for the storm. And, leading up to it, you knew for days it was going to come. And, the weather geek inside of you is really excited. You're like, wow, this is a once in a lifetime storm and it's coming right for me. And, you balance that out with, well, geez, people are going to die. There's going to be damage and there's going to be tremendous devastation. I was at Rutgers at the time. I was a senior then, and I was in charge of our TV weather department, weather watcher program at the time, and, planning coverage for that. And then I think I said this when we talked about our Superstorm Sandy 10-year anniversary episode. I ended up getting into a bicycle accident where I ended up with a concussion and I lost teeth, banged up my nose a little bit. And I was literally, just home with, if you ever had a concussion, with a very empty feeling, and you really couldn't, I really was just kind of out for the count during the storm. It was, in one way, it was actually pretty good because classes were canceled for a week and I wasn't going to school anyway because I was concussed. But, when you see the roller coaster that you've been on in the water, and, you see the places that you used to, go with your family and friends, be destroyed. And there was such a sense of unity among everybody in New Jersey to get this right and to pick things back up and to get us back in action. And, our Rutgers group, we went to Midway Beach, just south of Seaside Heights, to participate in a cleanup effort. That's actually how, in part, in a small way, I'm married to my now wife. That was like our first kind of like really talk to each other event that we did with that cleanup. So a lot of memories from Sandy, and we talk about it to this day. And, it was the biggest storm on record in terms of size, and it's not the worst storm we could have had at the Jersey Shore. We, in our circles here in Jersey, our realistic worst case scenario is a category 3 that really runs up the coast and provides it might not be as long lasting as Sandy, but a more powerful strike to the shore. So that's it for me. That's Sandy, without a doubt.
Yeah, that's quite the story, Joe. I love hearing you just tell it, because you can hear the emotion in your voice, how impactful that storm was. I did realize, though, while you were telling that story, there's probably something that we should have mentioned at the beginning of the show that I think we were overlooked. Our fellow co-host Kirsten not with us, and I didn't even mention why at the beginning, but it's kind of a big reason, because we also need to mention it because she's not going to be around for a while, because as of just yesterday, April 12th, she delivered a baby boy. So this is her third child. And so she's going to be on maternity leave until, I believe, late June. So she's going to be out for a while, but everything went fine. The baby is healthy. She is doing well. So all is good. We are so happy that is in the books for her now. And then she also has some time off to enjoy the baby. And she shared a picture, and it does look like a cute baby. I'm going to be honest. I don't think all babies are cute. Most babies are cute.
You're fired,
Matt. I think most babies are cute, but to be honest, not all are. But this one is. Kirsten's baby.
Is baby Matt cute?
Obviously,
I think
not.
so. But I'm just saying, not all babies are. I think that gets exaggerated a little bit. Now, you can't say that to anybody. You have to tell everybody their baby's cute. But I will honestly say that Kirsten's baby is cute.
They get cuter. They get cuter for sure.
There you go. Congratulations to her. We were really happy for her, and core part of this podcast. Without her, we wouldn't be doing this in the way in which we are. So she'll be back at the end of June, and I believe it's the end of June, and we're going to we're going to miss her the next couple of months. We'll still chat with her, three of us, but we'll have her back here, and I'm sure with some really good stories when we come back. But, send a congratulations over to her. You can follow her on Facebook at Kirsten Lang, and on Instagram as well. I believe it's Kirsten Lang 1, if I am correct. With that, I think we're going to wrap, right, Matt?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but just wanted to be clear, if you don't hear Kirsten, no, she was not fired. She went, make it very clear. She's just on maternity leave, enjoying some time with the family. But on that note, I hope you enjoyed this early look at hurricane season 2023. And of course, we will have other hurricane related episodes to come as we get closer to the season starting, and of course, covering all other topics weather related. And one other reminder, if you ever want, there's something you would like to hear us discuss, contact us on social media. We're always looking for ideas. So if there's something you want to hear discussed, shoot us an email, contact us on social media, and be a topic for next week's episode. But on that note, for Sean Sublette in Richmond, Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, I'm Matt Holiner in Chicago. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.